Kevin Pang of America's Test Kitchen. Joined with me, as always, Baxter Holmes, ESPN senior writer covering the NBA, and the man of the hour, the man of every hour, Steve Padilla. This is the Steve Padilla Sessions. We are talking about writing. Thanks so much for joining us. This is our second episode. Thanks for all the feedback so far on Twitter and on Facebook and on the YouTube channel, the YouTube page as well. Lots of great comments. Steve, you are, I believe, now an internet celebrity. Can we call you that?
Oh my God, what a thought.
So we are, this is meant to be just three guys with a love of writing, talking about the art and the craft of it. And we wanted to talk this week about something that was mentioned on Twitter as a topic that we want to talk about, which is self-editing. Now, since we last chatted, the last thing that Steve has suggested as an assignment for all of you watching this is the Steve Padilla challenge, which is, would you like to repeat this, Steve?
The 30-word challenge, which is when you think your story's done, cut 30 words. Not 50, not 100, just 30 words. And you'd be surprised, it's a way to just tighten the story ever so slightly. And it's a great exercise. And I do that myself. Even though, as I mentioned last time, I was doing a freelance piece for $1 a word and it cost me $30.
That's the part I still struggle to wrap my head around, but that's commitment.
Yeah.
Well, let me start from there, because that's actually a really good place to start. When the assignment is, you have to cut 30 words, right? What are, and I'm going to start by asking Steve first, and then I want to go to Baxter. What are the words that you're looking for? Are there specific words, turns of phrases? Are there words that seem superfluous that you say, okay, that's going to go out?
Well, let's put it this way. That famous line in Strunk and White is omit unnecessary words, right? I think that's the sentence from the book. But one thing they don't quite really say is, well, how do you find the unnecessary words? Because if I thought it was unnecessary, I wouldn't have written it. So, right. So I have some techniques. I have a whole bunch that I've jotted down that we can share. But one quick thing I do is I start scanning. This almost isn't really reading. This is just scanning. I just start looking for the prepositions. For, of, in, with, for. You'd be surprised. If you yank an of, you often take at least one, maybe two other words with it, possibly three. And if you have a long piece and you start it's weird. You're just looking for the ofs and the ins and the withs, and you start yanking those, and you find you can tighten the sentence ever slightly, and that adds up after a while. So that's one way. I know this maybe sounds silly, but that is one way to just tighten things ever so slightly. Another effective way to just deal with length issues, particularly when you just need to cut, let's say, we're talking newspaper writing, a few inches, or for magazines, a few, 100 words, is do what I call the verb check. And so when your story's done, again, this is almost just like scanning as opposed to really reading. Just look for the verbs and find, is it active voice or passive voice? And if you can convert it to active, that will generally shorten a sentence by about 1/3. I forget who figured that out, but someone did the math. And that will just tighten things ever so slightly. The only issue is if converting it to active screws up your meaning, don't do it. I mean, I think generally speaking, you do want to write active voice, but sometimes passive is there for a legitimate reason. But so you look at the prepositions, you look for the verbs, and that's a way to find out whether you really, where you can tighten. Actually, one great way to tighten stories, particularly for nonfiction, is one I shared with Baxter. Baxter, you want to tell about, because this was a habit when you were really, very, very early in the profession, it was about how you set up quotes.
It was the first thing when Kevin mentioned this, when you started talking, I was like, I wonder if Steve's going to mention the quote thing, because that's the first place I'm going to go. But yeah, Steve would say that oftentimes in trying to set up a quote, you give away the quote, right? You almost paraphrase the quote itself. And so Steve taught me that, and it totally, I mean, that has saved so much space. And I could almost always cut the lead-in sentence to a quote So if I had like, two or three leading sentences, I could cut like one or two right there and just, or tighten whatever overall the main lead in sentence. I would also look at the quote itself. Like I had a habit of somebody would say something, and because they said it to me and maybe they were somebody of importance, I felt that I needed to try to include all of it. And I needed to get out of that habit and to try to just, well, what is the essence of that quote? Maybe that quote is best. There's one sentence in that quote that says it all. It's the most powerful, punchy, lively, most telling thing. And I think I had one editor, I'm sure Steve, that you had said this to me, was that, it's rare that someone can say it in a quote better than you can write it. Like you are the writer.
I didn't tell you that. I wish I had, but you're right. Yeah.
Yeah, but I feel like that's something that a lot of editors say, and it's very true. It's like, yeah, we pay you to write this story, to report it out and write it. You better be able to write it better than someone can say it. Now, we the three of us, I'm sure, have come across people who are remarkably eloquent, or the certain things that they say are like, I couldn't say it better than that. That's really, that's really great. But being able to tighten quotes down to their essence and being very tuned into what the lead into that quote is, for me, is my that's the first thing I go to, and I am able to honestly cut a lot of reels just by doing that.
And just Kevin, so everyone understands what we mean about the lead in, you'll see this kind of thing in a story. I know I use this example in lectures. The president said he was dismayed. Quote, "I'm dismayed," said the president. You literally see that kind of stuff in news writing all the time. And so so what we found, and that was actually a habit. I mean, it wasn't as bad as that, but that was a thing that Baxter would set up his quotes a little more than needed. And
it's probably worse than that, Steve. Don't.
No. But what we pointed out was sometimes you do need the lead in, but maybe it can be just 1/3 or maybe half the length of what you wrote. And if the quote's really good, do you really need it at all? Right?
I was just going to go there. I remember there were times when we would sit side by side, and I would have some kind of lead in, and you'd cut the whole thing, and it would just go maybe from some reporting straight to a quote, and you'd say, are we missing anything? And I was like, oh my God, I didn't even need a setup. Like it flowed perfectly to it. It saved real estate. It almost made the quote feel more natural in a way.
And that's so because Kevin, he's a good reporter and he has a good ear for quotes. So they would just do the work for you. But this sounds really simple, but you'd be surprised if you have a story of length, if you just did the check the quotes, and this is how you do it. Since we're talking self-editing, you've got your draft, look for the quote, and then raise your eyes and read the sentence directly above the quote.
Yeah.
And that way you have a method, because if you rely on being creative, that ain't gonna work. You have to have a method, and you'd be surprised. You do that, you look for those ofs and those ins and those widths, you really can lose some real estate and tighten up a story. You'd be surprised.
I found out that the word that I keep using a lot and is the word that. And I found that if I take out the word that, 95% of the time it does not change the meaning of the sentence.
Oh, really? Okay.
Yeah. I mean, that's just sort of a tick of mine that I keep leaning onto. Do you have a word like that, Baxter?
Well, I had an editor once who taught me a trick about that, because he said that is a chronic thing that writers do, is use the word that too much. And so he actually said, you think about it in your mind, like almost the F word, F that. Take F, F all the that's in your story.
I like that.
You don't need them, and actually, it's funny you mention it. That's something that I do. I look at sentences. I was at a journalism institute in South Dakota, writing on a bus to as like Sioux City, Iowa for something. And I remember the editor said that, and it really stuck in my head. So I look for all the extra that's. I mean, honestly, if you had a long enough story, you were needing to trim 30 words, I'd say that's a quick place to start. I actually tend to start. Go ahead.
No, I was just going to say, to build upon your comment about quotes. there's almost a mathematical formula here. So in other words, if you've quoted someone in 2 sentences, if you really look at what they say, you probably only need one of the two, because the second sentence probably encapsulates some of the meaning of the first sentence. There are exceptions, and I'll bet you that often if you quoted someone in 3 sentences, you probably only need 2 of the 3. It's literally almost a formula. And again, when I need to just squeeze a story, I hate to say cut, when you squeeze a story, I will look at the quotes and almost do this formula, 2 to 1, 3 to 2.
Mm-hmm.
It doesn't always work.
Yeah.
So.
To Kevin's question about like, are there particular words? I look at that. I tend to start paragraphs with but or and. It's like I swear I could almost start every paragraph with and. It's almost like, and then this happened, and then that happened, and then they did this, and then all the way to I might as well just start the final sentence with the end, or something like that. I feel so. I go back and look. I'm like, okay, I cannot stack 10 paragraphs on top of each other that all begin with and. But I'm kind of like I'm trying to write like what do they say, like quick and dirty, like write it. You can go back and edit it. There's times when I'm also self-editing in a way where it's like every sentence has to be perfect. And I don't know how you guys feel about that, because we're talking about self-editing. And I think you can kind of get in your head about it while you're writing, this constant, like, it's not good enough. I need to tweak this. I need to change that. I've heard people say they like it has to be a perfect sentence. And then you stack that sentence on top of another perfect sentence. And it's like this really diligent, methodical way. Whereas other people have said like, write it quick, or, the quick and dirty version, and then start to shape it. It's clay and you're molding it and you're refining it, but you're not making the perfect pot on the first go around. So what are your guys' thoughts about self-editing as you're writing?
Well, Kevin, what's your method? I've got an idea, but I want to hear what you have to say about that.
Well, first off, I saw you shaking your head, and so I know where you're going to land on that, right? Okay, this is something that I actually picked up from all people, from Steve years ago when I was at the LA Times, was that first thing I do is I always print out the stories, because staring at it on a computer screen is going to look very different from staring at it on a piece of paper. But the other thing that Steve taught me was, because in newspapers, and I'm going to sound like an old man here, but you can actually print them in column inches, so that the words are not like, if you're looking at Microsoft Word or Google Docs, it's like all the way across the page, right? You can actually shrink it so that they're like 1 column each, and just by changing the view of it actually makes the words, makes the sentences look different. It really and one of the benefits of doing that is it actually shows me the different lengths of sentences, because like when it's like a very narrow margin, you actually can spot short sentences, long sentences, and specifically, and this is another Steve Padilla tip, is the idea of mixing, looking at sentence length and varying those length. I think once I was able to shrink, change the view into a very narrow width, did I start seeing those a lot clearly. So anyway, first thing I do is I always print those out. But anyway, I want to hear Steve talk more about that.
I think that's totally, I think it's almost a trick of the eyes, but just changing the look works. Now you might want to, if you can, you could set it, if you're writing for a newspaper, to actually make it look like a newspaper column, but you don't necessarily have to do that. If you're reading your text and it's 8 inches across, make it 5 inches across. Or 6, just if it's just different, somehow that you see things that you didn't before. So everything I edit, I will change the width, everything. And in fact, one of my other writing buddies, someone Baxter knows, the freelancer extraordinaire Jeff Maish, he mentioned that he sometimes changes the font, which I've never tried. But I think it's the same theory. Just make it look different, and it's like looking at it on a printout, as you mentioned.
Yeah.
Somehow, if you just change the look, you see things that you didn't see before.
Kevin, Steve taught me that very thing back when I was at the LA Times, and that was a complete game changer for me. And I remember, like it's like what, fit to text or fit to screen or something like that, and just squeezing it to what it would look like, in a newspaper, like the column inches. And I started, just as you were talking about, is really ringing true. Being able to recognize, like, wow, this paragraph way too long, or this sentence goes on forever. There's no way, so just the visual, getting a fresh perspective is really helpful in that way. I still do that. I've done it where I've changed the font. I've also done it where if I'm typing, I tend to write a lot in Google Docs. And I mean, all writers have their little ticks and whatnot. I tend to wear like a paragraph of text has to be a perfect rectangle. Like the last sentence has to run over to the very last point, and that's where the period can go. And I'm just, I'm just doing that on my first go around because I like, I don't know, for whatever reason, I want it to look neat. But then when I'm moving it, I can see like, oh, that's too long. I need to shrink that, or that works or whatever. So, I mean, to your guys' point, and again, this is something that Steve taught me, a fresh perspective, whether you're fitting it in a different way, changing the font. There's a tea place, tea shop near where I live in downtown LA, and I print out my stories, like especially if it's a longer project, because usually, like looking at it on a screen, you kind of get snowblind after a while, like just the light and the text, and you can't. It's like you can't really see it anymore. So I go and I print it out at a print shop nearby, and I'll get a cup of tea and a pen, and I just mark it up. Like I can cut that and cut that, whatever. And it's like I'm seeing it, in a fresh way. So I mean, those things are. It's amazing the things you catch doing that. That you didn't see the first go around. You're kind of, and you think to yourself like, how come I didn't see that? But I mean, it's important.
But I think you need. I think we all need aids to help us see things. That's why we changed the font. That's why we changed the width of the text. I forget if I did this with either of you guys. Did I ever show you color coding for stories and how that can solve a problem?
I remember you talking about it, especially like if there's long stories and certain characters in the story and like they've been absent for a long time, or if it's a chronological story or something like that. I think I'll let you.
What I've done. Yeah, what I've done is, particularly if I had a long piece, and I can think of one in particular that I helped a guy with who isn't even with the LA Times, but I had coached him one time and he asked me to look at a piece, and it was a murder mystery. And so what I did was it had a lot of people, and I was hard keeping everything straight. So what I ended up doing was I gave every person who was named a different color. So there was like blue and green, red, black. Kevin, I ran out of colors because there were just so many people. So then some people were in boxes, some people were in circles, some people had squiggly lines under them. And that was the only way I could keep track of them. And so I did this for the whole piece almost mechanically after I'd already read it once. And then I set out all the pages. And then I could see why it wasn't holding together, because the issue was that you would lose the thread and you could literally see the thread disappear. So for example, if the thread was Mr. Blue, he went away for far too long. And so I realized, we need to throw some blue here and some blue there mixed in with Mr. Red and Mr. Orange or something like that. And one of and there were two other things that really jumped out at me in that story. There was an awful lot of green. I remember this vividly. It was green. There was a lot of it. There was so much green that I wondered if the story was framed incorrectly, if actually Mr. Green should have been one of the lead characters. Wasn't. The reason Green appeared so much was Green was I think he was a teenager gang member who witnessed a killing, and the reporter had obtained a transcript of the police interview. So since he had this great material, of course, he felt it was more valuable and he wanted to use it. So there was tons of this kid in there, and it was dramatic stuff, but he wasn't the main point. Conversely, I mentioned Mr. Blue. There was a guy in blue who did not appear in the story enough. He really was supposed to be one of the main characters. And so one of my recommendations was, less green, more blue. And the other thing was, Kevin and Bax, I wonder if you guys have run into this. I realized that there were too many characters, that how many different police officers do you need to quote saying the same thing? Can you consolidate? And so another one of my recommendations was, and I didn't tell him who, I said, but can you actually just get rid of some people? I don't know if you guys have run into that ever.
Kevin, do you want to? I definitely have thoughts on this, but Kevin, do you want to?
I want to hear from you, Bax.
Yeah, I mean, especially for in-depth projects where I'm trying to interview as many people as I can. And I think there is, Kevin, I'm sure you've run into this. You can almost hit a wall at one point where, you're not really getting any more new information. Most people, even new people you're interviewing, are kind of saying the same kind of things that other people are saying. Like you've closed the loop, so to speak. And there does come a point, and Steve's absolutely right, where you could have like 10 people who are more or less saying the same thing or kind of close. There's not a ton of like to really differentiate it. But you feel obligated in some ways as a reporter because you interviewed everybody and they know they talked to you and they took their time and you made the effort. And maybe they were a hard interview to get to try to quote them in a story. And so that's like you have your reporter and your writer hat on at that point. And also, I think there's times when you want to really show the reader how much work you put into it. How many people the lengths you went to get all this information, how many people you interviewed, so on. But yeah, I mean, that can come with a fresh perspective of like, this has happened to me several times. I'm perpetually working on things where I've interviewed a number of people who are kind of all saying the same thing. And so then it's like, all right,
and you do want to be respectful,
Right.
respectful of them, and certain sources give the piece certain credibility. So
Right,
I'm thinking,
and
stuff that maybe doesn't have to be attributed to 3 different people, like the time of the shooting. Okay,
yeah. And so
that kind
these are the decisions that you have to make ultimately about, like, again, your point, how many characters. I think of, I don't know if you guys have read, I think it was a famous Esquire story. It was just called like M, by John Sack. It was the story of M Company in Vietnam. It was like a 30,000 word saga of a story. He followed this entire like troop from like basic training over into Vietnam. And that story has, I don't know, like 15 or 20 characters, but it's like 30,000 word long. I mean, it works because there's that kind of length. It's that kind of sweeping story. For most, I mean, even a 5,000 word piece, you can't, you really need to be careful on how many characters or people because people get, you lose track of things. So, and you can lose focus and whatnot. So I absolutely try to be more cognizant of this. And how many people I'm quoting, why exactly am I quoting them? What are they saying? How different is that than somebody else? Their credibility, how much credibility are they lending to the piece necessarily? And that's another way. I mean, just these simple decisions, especially if you've interviewed a ton of people for an in-depth story or whatever, it's another great way to, I mean, it's a little bit of like killing your babies, so to speak. I know it's the phrase about editing. And I feel that way at times, cutting people's, information they've given me or their name out of a story potentially. But it's important to respect the reader's attention span to try to make the story as tight and as condensed as possible.
A great little lesson I learned along these lines was from, he was our managing editor, at the time at the LA Times, Mark Duvoisin. And this was a brilliant edit. We had this piece, and I can get you the link, Kevin. We can attach it to the story here so people can read. And it was by Richard Fawcett, who's now with the New York Times. And it was a narrative about a undocumented immigrant named Pedro who was facing an immigration hearing. By the way, one of the writing techniques in that story is there are no quotes from interviews. The quotes only come from action, which is a very subtle way of putting the reader there. Most people won't spot it, but now you know. Anyway, near the top of the story, it's about the wife of the immigrant is loading up the car because they're going to drive from North Carolina to Georgia for the immigration hearing. And her mother's boyfriend was playing piano while this is all going on. And so we had a thing in there about how he was playing this music that was urgent, and I think the phrase was urgent and sad, like the day itself. Now, in the original version, it named the boyfriend, and actually gave some biographical information about him, which I thought just slowed things down. So I took out the biographical information and just left the name. And oddly enough, I remember his first name was Milo something, and he's playing the piano, right? Okay, so the story is going through, other editors are looking at it at the paper, and there was one editor who just hated that part. She just thought it was distracting, we didn't need it, take it out. And then meanwhile, the column one editor and I really liked it, we wanted to keep it. And there was another editor who wasn't wild about it. But then Mark had the brilliant solution. He said, keep the line about the boyfriend playing the piano, because the important thing was the music. He said, just take his name out, because Milo got mentioned later in the story anyway. So yes. So, because Mark said, the important thing isn't that his name is Milo. The important thing is the soundtrack that he was providing for that dramatic scene. And Milo, we're not being disrespectful, because Milo shows up later in the story anyway. And so that was an interesting kind of a halfway point before, that's sort of a variation on what you were just talking about, where maybe you do include the name, but maybe the issue is, when do you include it?
Yeah.
So that was, I've used that a lot, that lesson from that little thing.
So how did that
Mark
change?
suggested.
How did it change the tone of that particular section? Like, what was the before and after in terms of how it read for the reader, and the emotions?
It made the tone better because it was one less name to remember, because it focused on just the mood of the day, which was the point. And at that point in the story, we've mentioned Pedro, we've got his wife packing the car. I think it mentioned their kid. And I think it mentions, and then it mentions her mom, and then we had the boyfriend. So that's 5 people. And anytime you add a name to a story, that's work for the reader to remember. So anyway, I just thought it was brilliant, because you had some editors who said, keep it as is. Others said, no, it's distracting, take it out. And then Mark said, keep it, just take his name out. Particularly since Milo shows up later. If Milo hadn't shown up later, then maybe you'd argue, well, you need to keep it in. You can't just say the boyfriend and not have any further explanation. But I thought that was a brilliant little edit. Not to mention the fact it saved a few words.
Yeah.
Too.
It's not really
so
like
that
a
one stay with me.
It's not a binary thing of you either keep it or you take it. Well, there could be a middle ground as well.
Always. You know, one other thing I think is important is I think writers just have to accept the fact that nothing comes out right the first time. And so when you are revising, that's not a sign of weakness. That's not a sign of bad writing. That's just the process, right? So I don't think people should get worked up about.
Let's unpack this though, because I
do want to pack this, because let's go back to the moment about 10 minutes ago when you were shaking your head, Steve. And this is something that I do. And Max mentioned this. I cannot go to the next sentence until the current sentence is perfect. I feel like as a writer that I am negligent if I leave it in the raw, unedited, unperfect, unvarnished state, and I just can't go on. So
Steve, you're one of those.
Talk me off the ledge.
One of those.
One of those. Oh God. Are you okay? Are you particularly that way with leads, with the starts of stories?
Of course. Yeah, leads and endings. I know, but that's how the sausage gets made,
Yeah.
I don't think there's anything wrong with I mean, if I feel like I have a strong lead that's engaging, and it might not be perfect, but if I can get it pretty close, and I'm going to be refining, because Kevin, I don't know if you do this, when I'm writing a story, I always will start rereading it from the very beginning. Like I might be onto the second section or the third section, but I always start rereading it from the very beginning. And if I have a bad opening, it's like a bad taste in my mouth for the whole story. And I'm the one who wrote it, so it's my fault, and I need to do a better job. But if I feel like I have a good, and I can come back and make it better, whatever. But if I feel like if I have a really strong opening that it gives me confidence for like moving forward. Now, I'm not saying it has to be perfect on the very go around. There was probably a time like that, and I've kind of veered more towards the just write it and then we can refine it later. It doesn't have to be perfect on the first go around, but that is a little bit of an ego trip, because like knowing that your first draft is kind of crap, and just being able to accept it, and knowing that you're going to make it better, or it'll be better through the editing process. I always tell my editors, I'm like, I'm sorry for the way this first draft looks. Even after I've re-edited it and refined it and done all the tips and techniques, I always, in the email subject line, I say rough, and I put rough in all caps.
You just made me come to a realization.
Good idea.
And this is actually sort of like the inverse of what you're just describing, right? I think one of the reasons why I try to make each sentence like, perfect before I go to the next one. Actually, it might not be one of the reasons, but it's certainly a consequence of it, is that once I get further down to the story and I'm having trouble with a particular passage, I do what you do, and I go back to the top of story and I read it. And I feel like, and this realization came just as you were mentioning this, I feel like it is me procrastinating, and I'm trying to validate myself by reading what brilliant writing that I've had in the first 5 paragraphs, and hoping that the brilliance of that will inspire me to actually like get through the block of like not being able to, break through the trouble part. Did you ever get that? Like there's something egotistical about
I absolutely do. I lose faith in myself, and then I go back to like the good first paragraph I wrote before I was kind of feeling like burnout from whatever at the end of a long writing session. I'm just like, I'm on fumes. I'm like, oh yeah, I can write. Like I can do this. Like I did this, so I can do this later in the story, and I know how to do this.
Yeah.
So when all your confidence is like sapped and shaken, you kind of go back to the well again with that good opening. But I really do toil with the opening. You mentioned the ending. Chris Jones, who's an amazing writer, was with Esquire for I think like 14 years. He always talked about the ending and having it be like the place that you're going, like the destination. And that's probably something we'll talk more about in structure. But in terms of self-editing, I'm often thinking about, if the opening is really good and I have a sense of where I'm going with the ending, I'm rewriting constantly and editing even within the framework of the story, because I don't want to let down the opening, right? That's what you're talking about. And I know I'm going somewhere good, so I better make the middle of this thing, so I'm rewriting a lot. But Steve makes a great point, and this is why everyone needs an editor. You have to kind of, I don't want to say give in a little bit, but you have to accept that the version that you're writing, no matter how much editing you do on it yourself, and you're changing the margins, you're color coding, you're looking at quotes, when you get someone else's eyes on it, particularly someone who really knows what they're doing, like Steve, they are going to make it a lot better. And especially if you have multiple like skilled, talented editors. So you have to kind of like just, swallow your pride. No one writes a perfect first draft. It's never happened in the history of writing. I don't think I know we're not supposed to never say never, but I feel pretty safe saying it'll never happen to anyone. But Steve, what are your thoughts on drafts and, yeah. Anyways.
Well, this reminds me of, I'm not going to get the quote entirely right, but the novelist and humor writer Paul Rudnick, he does essays for the New Yorker a fair amount. He had a play in LA, and he was interviewed by the paper, and there was a quote along the lines of that his biggest nightmare was having the first draft of a story on him, and he gets hit by a bus, and people find it, read it, and then think that he thought it was good.
Oh,
that was his
that's
his nightmare. Yeah.
God, that's a pretty chilling nightmare, I think.
Yeah, terrible. I know. I think we can all relate to it. But Kevin, I think I don't think the opening has to be perfect. But on the other hand, I don't believe in just slapping down anything to move on. I think all of us feel it has to have some sort of value.
There's a middle ground, right?
Yeah, the middle ground. But I don't think it has to be perfect. And I've worked with many people who will not move to the second sentence unless the first one is in their minds perfect. And then they're paralyzed. I think two thoughts about openings. One technique that I think I've done with both you guys, and I found this very valuable. Actually, I did this just yesterday. Is so editors out there, pay attention. I encourage people to send me the openings of their stories. First, I don't know, 5, 6, 8, 10 graphs. But what I always say is not for red pencil editing, not for line editing. I always say it's too soon for that, because it is. And I said, this is just to see, are you headed in the right direction in terms of tone and in how you're framing the story? And so notice that I'm trying to take the performance aspect out of it by saying it doesn't have to be perfect. We just want to get a rough idea. It's kind of like you, Baxter, writing rough, in the subject line of the piece, right?
I feel like I'm giving myself an out when I say that, by the way. So
well, no, but it's the truth too. It's not an out; it's the truth. And so what I find is, and this has worked with whether I've been working with reporters who are right out of college or folks who've been at the paper for decades, is they send me the opening, and of course I am in reality dying to pencil edit the thing, but I won't because I promised I wouldn't. And so what I end up doing was I can just say, all right, we're headed in the right direction, absolutely. Or I can say, maybe we could head this way. And I won't give them word edits at that stage, because that'll just put them in a straitjacket. But I find that that's helpful. In fact, where that really is helpful is when you find people starting a piece with an anecdotal lead and they're using the wrong anecdote. I think this is fairly common in newspaper writing, where people grab the anecdote that's the most. It's the most violent. It's the funniest. It's the sexiest. It's the weirdest. It's the most unusual. It's the most. And because it's so unusual, they figure that will draw the reader in. So I'll put that at the top. But often that's not what the story's really about. And so it's pretty common to see this, an anecdote that's actually probably pretty well written, and it is indeed grabby, but it's not really what the story's about. So I'll find that when people show me those rough tops, I can, stop that. But the important thing is, if the anecdote is that arresting and interesting, you probably want it in the story somewhere, because it does relate to the topic, but maybe it's not appropriate to launch the rocket.
Steve, is there anything that you say to writers who, as you were kind of mentioning with Kevin, who it has to be a perfect sentence, and then the next sentence has to be perfect and whatnot? I mean, you're working with people who can be on tight deadlines, but that they are perfectionists in a way. So what do you, as an editor, what do you say when you come across these folks? How do you coax the best out of them
Besides, toughen up, Buttercup.
It's hard.
You just tap your watch and say, look, we're going to press with or without you.
Sometimes you have to. I've worked with this one writer who she had to have she could not go on unless the opening was perfect to her. And I begged her, and she'd tell me all about the story. And I remember she shared this whole anecdote that she was going to use in the story. And I suggested she just write up the anecdote on her screen, that it wouldn't be the lead, but since she was going to use it somewhere, I suggested, why don't you just write up the anecdote just to have it on your screen, and then you can use it. No, wouldn't do it. She could not write that scene by itself unless she had her opening. So I wasn't very successful with her at all. I remember that. She just had to have those openings. So I did find it useful to ask her, send me the rough top, emphasizing the word rough, so I could, reinforce the so that way, if she was headed down the right track, I could tell her that. She would feel good about herself. She'd feel good about the story, and then off to the races she'd go.
Yeah. Let's circle back to self-editing here as we're about to wrap up.
Okay.
Some of the things that we talked about are printing out the stories, changing the fonts, which, by the way, I found that changing it from a serif font to a sans serif font often helps, because it's almost like I'm not sure if this is the best analogy, but it's almost like changing a song from a major chord to a minor chord. There's just something about looking at the the way that a particular font looks of a serif font versus a sans serif font. So that's helpful. Changing the width of it, color coding it as well. Also looking for specific words and prepositions and the word that's. Any other tips we want to leave our viewers and listeners with for things to look out for when it comes to self-editing?
Time travel, particularly if you have a narrative, and flashbacks can indeed work, but you want to use those sparingly. And sometimes you have stories that both of you guys have worked on stories that unfolded over years and years and years. Kevin, I know we'll at a future episode talk about your award-winning profile of a chef, and that takes place in multiple time frames. Baxter, you did that piece about the town in one of the Carolinas that's famous for producing an unusually large number of NBA players, if I recall correctly, right? Yeah. And that also unfolds in different eras. And there may be some, so anyway, I think one thing to be careful of if you're doing anything that involves time travel is to really see how often you're doing it, because you only want to do that so often, maybe twice a story. I think it can be confusing to people. The other thing is, I think there are a few key words to look for that might indicate your structure is screwy. If you find that you've used the words, I jotted them down, still, meanwhile, and no offense, Baxter, but still and meanwhile, not that you can't use those, they're fine words, but if you find that they are appearing a lot in your story, that might mean that you've sent people down a certain path and you're trying to bring them home another direction. So those are some of my ones. I don't know if I ever shared those with you guys.
Meanwhile, that's a good one.
Yeah, I love that because like really, I think I like Baxter, I use the word but because I like the sound of the word and the way that it sounds, when I'm reading it in my head. But really, if I'm using the word but, it means that it has to contradict the previous paragraph. And a lot of times it's not really,
it doesn't really contradict it.
Like a transition sentence, right? And that's why I'm using it. I just like the sound of it. So yeah, excellent points there. Baxter, any sort of, closing ideas, points, tips, hacks for when you're self-editing that's our viewers can take away with them?
I think that being able to take, this is kind of a big picture thing, but being able to take your writer, reporter hat off and put on your editor hat. I think Steve was the one who taught me that. Like, you have to remove yourself and all the work that you put into it and the idea and all the effort and the writing and everything. You have to remove yourself from it. And with clear eyes, again, maybe printing it out or changing the margins, look at the text as if it wasn't your text and just think like, this isn't good. How can I make this better? Right. And I remember just thinking about that concept. Like, I need to take myself out of my own body in a way, distance myself from this story, the fact that I did it, and however I might feel about the copy, and just look at it in a way that, okay, if this was somebody else's and it was handed to me and I wanted to make it better, how do I do it? Like, pretend it's not even mine, pretend it's someone else's and I'm trying to make it better. And even just looking at it from that perspective has honestly been helpful for me, because it is hard to remove yourself from it. You made it, but I think you have to force yourself in a way to do it, to look at it with clear eyes, to see all the stuff that doesn't need to be in there, or at least to see a lot of it before it eventually gets to the editor. I want to turn in the best version of a story I can to an editor, and then they're going to polish it and make it even better. And maybe some others will first, but I want to turn in the best version of that. And so I have to force myself to look at it with a different perspective. And that's the key thing. And then it goes to all the things that Steve said, and again, for me, looking at the quotes and the lead-ins to quotes, or whether there even needs to be a lead in all, is a very key thing. But just that perspective for me is huge. Can't recommend it enough.
And Kevin, can I just suggest one sort of philosophical approach that I think kind of ties everything together? Our benediction for the night, I guess, is to try to look at this process in a positive way. I think too many people think, oh, they're cutting my story. They're cutting. And I like to say we're squeezing rather than cut. And when you're looking for stuff that's repetitious, don't think of it as I'm looking for repetition. I think when you're looking at your text, you basically, and let's say you have two sentences that essentially convey the same information. I think the takeaway isn't, oh, look, I repeated myself. I think the takeaway is, this sentence does the work for me. This sentence is so good, it carries the load. So this one we can, give it the day off. And I think so. I just think it helps to be more positive about the process of refining and squeezing the copy, as opposed to viewing it as, oh, we're cutting my gorgeous work. So I think if you just have that mindset, it becomes much more fun.
Yeah, and we can go one step beyond that.
It's not punitive.
We're burning calories, we're polishing, or turning it from a piece of marble into Michelangelo's David, perhaps.
Exactly.
Excellent. Well, gentlemen, this has been great. And for those of you who are watching this, thank you so much for watching all the way through. Please leave any comments, questions in the comment sections below. And you can reach out to Baxter, myself, and of course, Steve on Twitter. You can find all that in the description below. Bax, Steve, thank you so much. Thanks for joining us. And we will see you next time on the Steve Padilla Sessions.